It was recommended that I check out Brian Holdsworth's videos if I wanted to see, quote, true intellectual Christianity, unquote. All right then, challenge accepted. Let's see what this titan of Christian logic can bring to the table.
If you've ever taken an interest in, especially, theistic or Christian apologetics, or been introduced to classical or medieval philosophy, then you've probably heard some arguments for the existence of God. And it's also true that some of those arguments will resonate with certain people more than others.
And the issue with much of apologetics is that it often serves as an emotional salve for those grappling with doubt, rather than a serious attempt at dispassionate inquiry. But conclusions drawn from logical arguments should be evaluated on the basis of their internal coherence and evidential support, not how emotionally comforting they are. This shows us a deeper difference between apologetics and philosophical or scientific argumentation. The former often prioritizes affirming belief, while the latter seeks truth regardless of the outcome. This isn't to say that all apologetic arguments are devoid of logical form, but the purpose of apologetics is often to reaffirm a conclusion they already hold, whereas in philosophy or science, the conclusion should emerge from the argument, not precede it. Apologetics is the marketing to engineering's logic.
Personally, I've always found that the moral argument and then certain versions of the ontological argument are the most convincing for me. But I recently had what I might call like a breakthrough in my own appreciation for St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological arguments that might just now make them my new favorites. And the reason is because I was introduced to an analogy that helped me kind of close the gaps in my own understanding of how they work and what it is that makes them so convincing. And I realized after I had this epiphany that it would be greedy of me to keep it to myself. So I thought I would share it here on my channel, starting with the analogy.
Personally, I have never found either the moral or ontological arguments logically compelling. The moral argument often hinges on the apologist's own incredulity, specifically the inability to imagine how moral frameworks could emerge naturally, while also depending on colloquial definitions that don't hold up under formal logical scrutiny. And the ontological argument, whether in Anselm's classical form or Plantinga's modal logic framework, functions as more of an exercise in linguistic definitions than a demonstration of existence in any ontological or empirical sense. TLDR, just because you can conceptualize the maximally greatest anything doesn't necessitate its existence. Concepts are a part of abstract human thought, not magic. So if God is only a human concept, the ontological argument might suffice. It still has logical weaknesses. But if God is meant to exist in reality, then a conceptual argument, grounded in human language and vulnerable to flawed formalism, falls far short of adequate justification. Ultimately, conceptual coherence isn't enough. A God that actually exists would need to intersect with reality in a way that can be examined, tested, or at the very least, meaningfully defined, none of which the ontological argument achieves.
So imagine you're in just a wide open space that stretches on seemingly to infinity in every direction. But like the environment that you experience here on Earth, everything that appears in this space is pulled downward by something like a gravitational force, even though there's no ground.
Now, for an analogy to be effective, it needs to be grounded in at least some recognizable physical or conceptual reality, and what Brian is proposing here doesn't even meet that basic standard. Gravity, as currently understood, is not just a mysterious pulling force, but a result of mass curving spacetime. For there to be gravitational attraction, there must be mass present to generate it. So for Brian's analogy to hold, we'd have to be in a state of freefall. The only physically plausible scenario where this applies meaningfully is orbital freefall, where an object perpetually falls around a planet due to its tangential velocity. Over time, minor forces like microgravity could cause deorbiting, leading to eventual burning up in the atmosphere, but we're supposed to be playing make-believe here, so oh well, I guess. That said, for the sake of the argument and under noted protest to the absurdity of the scenario, I'll accept the premise and assume that, through some exotic but unspecified mechanism, we're in continuous freefall within the otherwise empty space. It's important to highlight, though, that a faulty or physically incoherent analogy risks undermining the point it aims to clarify, especially if the analogy itself introduces more conceptual confusion than the idea it's meant to illustrate.
Um, I get that doesn't make sense, but just indulge me. It's hypothetical.
That is not a proper hypothetical. Hypotheticals are grounded in logical structure and coherence, or used to explore the implications of coherent premises. This isn't hypothetical, it's imaginary. I realize this might come across as pedantic, but theists often use scientific terminology, like hypothetical in theory, in a more casual, colloquial manner in order to appear more authoritative. And Brian is doing exactly that here.
And for the sake of those drawn towards pedantic questions, those of us who are in this space were supported by a platform that prevents us from falling down. We are in a static position.
No, that did not remotely resolve the issues I have with this analogy.
And then we notice in this space that there is a chandelier hanging by a chain, and the chain just goes up way beyond our ability to see where it ends. Now, we know everything in this environment, if left unsuspended, will fall, right?
Do we, though? This scenario already violates the known laws of physics. So do we truly know that everything in this imaginary environment will fall? Or is that just another rule you've invented for the sake of the analogy? This reveals a recurring issue in how Brian constructs and evaluates his arguments. There's an assumption baked into his premise, the assumption that gravity still operates normally, even though we've already suspended disbelief by accepting perpetual falling without any mass to generate gravitational force. This is why apologetics often fails under scientific, logical, or philosophical scrutiny. It front-loads its conclusions into the premises through unexamined assumptions. In science and philosophy, you cannot simply assume your conclusions. Aside from foundational axioms, those rare statements that remain unprovable due to the limitations in our current formal logical systems, every term must be clearly defined and every premise must be justified. Without that careful structure, you're not engaging in critical thinking, you're exercising imagination and mistaking it for revelation.
We can take objects like out of our pockets, for example, and hold them out like this and just let them go, and we notice that they drop into the void. But this chandelier that we observe isn't falling. So if we're inquisitive and rational, we would probably ask ourselves, why doesn't the chandelier fall? What's holding it up? And if you really wanted an explanation that accounted for the actual depths of that question, that got right to the heart of it, would you be satisfied if someone answered you by saying, well, it's attached to a chain link right above it. You can see it there. That's what's holding it up. I hope you would say no. I would certainly find that unsatisfying, because that raises the inevitable follow-up question, which is, well, what's holding that link up? And an equally unsatisfying answer would be, well, the link above it. None of those explanations really accounts for how the chandelier manages to resist falling into the void. Because based on appearance, the links in the chain go on for as far as we can see. But just because we can't physically see the end of the chain, that doesn't mean there is no end. That would be jumping to a conclusion that we don't really have the grounds to make. But even if the chain did go on indefinitely, it still wouldn't explain what's holding it all up.
There are several major flaws with this analogy, both logically and scientifically. First, this analogy overlooks the scientific perspective entirely, specifically the real and measurable limits of human exploration. For the analogy to have real-world relevance, a human observer would need to physically investigate the chain beyond the limits of vision and report their findings. Since this analogy is ignoring physics altogether, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that in order to do this, they climb the chain. Eventually, through effort, we reach the limit of the human ability to climb, due to biological constraints, environmental factors, or simply time. I mean, we do die eventually. Hey, if Brian is front-loading assumptions into this analogy, it's equally fair to assume that humans aren't immortal, meaning we eventually die, and our ability to investigate ends. This illustrates a key feature of the scientific method. It recognizes real limits. Eventually, we must admit that we simply do not know. In this case, there are two logically valid answers to the question, what's holding the chain up? One is epistemic humility. I don't know. The other is inductive reasoning. Given that we've only observed chain so far, it's reasonable to infer that there's simply more chain. This is ignoring a far more critical flaw in Brian's analogy, one that contradicts his own premises. In Brian's scenario, we're in freefall. That means the chandelier is falling too. Since it remains stationary relative to us, it must be falling at the same rate. There's no need to ask what's holding it up. Nothing is. It's falling with us. So the answer to the question, what's holding up the chandelier, is nothing. It's falling too.
An infinite regress of explanations that don't actually account for what's going on here isn't a more satisfying explanation.
Brian's sentence here highlights a key difference between apologetics and science. Apologetics often seeks the most emotionally satisfying explanation. Science seeks explanations grounded in logic, evidence, and falsifiability. Saying that an infinite regress isn't a more satisfying explanation doesn't mean it's not possibly true. It's saying that an infinite regress is one of the many theoretical possibilities. And right now, none of the proposed conclusions have more scientific weight than the others, because we have exactly zero empirical evidence about what preceded the first measurable moment in our universe. Let's cut to the chase. What we're really talking about is the moment before the first calculable Planck time in the lambda CDM model of Big Bang cosmology, the point beyond which our current physics breaks down.
Just because you add more bad explanations to the question doesn't get us to an actual sound explanation.
Brian introduces a subtle rhetorical sleight of hand here by dismissing scientific or philosophical explanations as bad explanations, a move that misrepresents how scientific models actually work. The lambda CDM model is currently the most widely accepted cosmological framework for explaining the expansion of the universe, as it accounts for the full range of observational data we possess. Unanswered questions in the model point to areas of incomplete understanding, not to a failure of the model itself, and certainly not to it being a bad explanation. Contrary to Brian's objection, an infinite regress is a conceptually coherent explanation. It stands on equal evidentiary footing with other origin hypotheses, given that none currently rest on empirical data beyond the Planck epoch.
And the reason we know this is because if we remove a link from the middle of the chain and then we reattach the one above it and below it so that the chain stays intact, and then we take that one link and we hold it out and we drop it, what would happen? It would fall, right?
No, the link wouldn't fall, because as we've already established, the chandelier isn't suspended at all. It's falling right along with everything else in the system. Detaching a piece of chain in a free-falling environment doesn't change anything because nothing was being held up to begin with. But this brings up a bigger issue. Why are we assuming gravity exists in this imaginary space at all? In a vacuum with no reference points, there's no down. We could just as easily be floating inertially next to the chandelier, and the scenario would look exactly the same. We'd still be able to observe the chandelier, interact with it, and climb the chain until we reach the limits of our ability. And that's where this analogy completely shatters. It assumes, without ever justifying it, that the chandelier must be held up. Why? Because it feels like common sense. But that's the trap. It only makes sense because we're used to how things behave under Earth's gravity. This is a classic apologetic move, relying on intuitions that feel obvious even when they don't apply. Of course, the chandelier needs support. Of course, something must be holding it. Of course, the chain has to be anchored to something, right? But in this imaginary setup, that's not obvious at all. The moment we stop importing real-world physics into the made-up world, the logic of the analogy falls apart. In fact, if everything is in freefall, then invoking gravity, let alone something resisting it, is just unjustified and incoherent. Now, once that collapse happens, Brian's conclusion loses its foundation. His whole chain of reasoning, pun intended, depends on the chandelier hanging from something, and there being a final unmoved cause. But if the whole scenario is in motion and nothing is actually suspended, there's no reason to expect a terminus at all. We're more likely to find the chain that just ends. Or loops back in on itself, or was never hanging in the first place. It just happened to latch onto the chandelier in an infinite regress of events that happened while the chandelier itself was falling. And this matters because what Brian is trying to do here is sneak in the contingency argument, just dressed up with metaphors. He wants to say, since everything we observe depends on something else, the universe must also depend on something, and that something must be a necessary being, i.e. God. But that logic makes two key mistakes. First, it assumes that the universe is a thing the same way a chandelier is. But the universe isn't a singular object. It's a label we gave to everything observable. It's a conceptual container, not a physical item hanging on something. Second, we have observed many things being built from other physical things, but we've never observed a universe coming into existence. We have no empirical or conceptual basis for assuming it must have been caused, let alone caused by a being with a nature to exist. And that's the subtle trick. By treating the universe like a chandelier, the analogy hides its presuppositions behind imagery. But when we pull those assumptions into the light, we see the argument doesn't hold. This is why rigorous analysis matters, because once you strip away the rhetoric and metaphors, the underlying logic often evaporates.
And if we unlinked the chandelier in the same fashion from the chain, it would also fall, which tells us that both the chain and the chandelier depend on something else to hold them up. It's not in their nature to stay suspended. It's in their nature to fall. So claiming that the chain is a qualified explanation for why the chandelier stays up is obviously logically false. Something must be holding the chain up, and it must be in the nature of that thing to not fall. If we could somehow travel to the end of the chain and observe like a platform that the last link is then anchored to, it would have to be in the nature of that platform not to fall. That's the key logical point in all of this.
And this is an excellent example of how apologists will work backwards from a conclusion instead of forwards from evidence. Brian has already assumed that the chandelier must be held up. He has presupposed that the chains holding the chandelier must be attached to an unmoving platform. The problem is that, as previously demonstrated, the underlying premises are flawed. In contrast, the consistent evaluation of the scenario reveals no need to assume a non-moving platform. In fact, under the principle of relativity, the very concept becomes incoherent. This aligns with my atheist view. The concept of a non-moving platform is not just unproven, it's conceptually meaningless without a relativistic framework. In a relativistic system, any object outside your frame of reference would be fundamentally undetectable, unable to interact or even appear consistent within your observable reality. If the chandelier were anchored to such a platform, it wouldn't be falling. It would sit or move just outside your frame of reference, being unobservable. Or the platform must necessarily be falling as well, making the definition of non-moving incoherent. And this is where apologetic analogies routinely collapse. They borrow intuitive language from our daily experiences, apply it in incoherent contexts, and then use those broken constructs to justify metaphysical conclusions.
If a thing is doing something that isn't in its nature to do it, like suspend in midair, then something else must explain how it is able to do that. But if, as you follow the sequence of causes, you only find objects that also aren't able to suspend themselves in midair, then you haven't gotten to an explanation, because logically, you have to know that as long as things are doing something that they can't do on their own, there must be a cause in the sequence that can do that thing of its own nature. And if you don't agree or you refuse to draw that very necessary logical conclusion, then you have to be content with an incoherent conclusion, which is that the chandelier is being held up by things that can't hold themselves up, let alone anything else like the chandelier. And to draw incoherent conclusions is to embrace irrationality.
Brian, considering how incoherent the analogy has become under scrutiny, I think the real question is, who exactly is embracing irrationality here?
You've discarded reason at that point. So let's bring this analogy into our own reality. So we observe that you and I and everything around us exist, right? That's pretty obvious.
Brian's committing the same error here he's committed previously, assuming common sense holds true, but he does not address that there are a variety of philosophical stances that state that you cannot prove that anything exists outside of your own mind. As an empiricist, I hold that the things I can interact with, the things that provide my brain with sensory feedback, exists. This doesn't solve the brain in a vat problem or the problem of hard solipsism, but I'm not pretending it does. I'm just stating that, for me, what can be measured and tested repeatedly can be presumed to exist. What's happened here is exactly what I've been pointing out all along. Brian starts with assumptions disguised as common sense, that things must be held up, that contingent things require a cause, that causes must contain all properties of their effects, and then uses a collapsing analogy to smuggle in the unmoved mover argument. But once you examine the premises, the internal logic falls apart. So when the argument fails to deliver, he simply turns to revelation, miracles, and prophecy, none of which were supported by the original argument. Brian doesn't use reasoning from evidence, he constructs a scaffolding to justify his already held belief. Now, there's no need to keep responding to the remainder of this video. Brian's conclusions rest on a faulty premise, and anything further would just repeat what we've already dismantled. From here, he trots out the classical contingency argument and layers on more unsupported claims, like the idea that intelligence can only come from intelligence or will from will. That might sound intuitive, but it's just cold assertion. It's not logically necessary, and it's certainly not evidenced. We see emergent intelligence in nature, through evolution, and even in modern AI systems. Brian's claim completely ignored the field of emergentism, an entire branch of philosophy that explores how complex phenomenon like consciousness can arise from non-conscious components. And when we finally shift from metaphysics to theology, asserting that only revelation can tell us about this supposed necessary being, he's not making a logical case. He's just smuggling in his religious conclusions under the guise of reason. In short, we go from something exists to therefore Jesus, and that leap is exactly what needs evidence. Brian provides none. This argument was so poorly constructed that it makes a first for me. This is the only video so far that I've stopped responding to halfway through because the intellectual value just isn't there. If anybody watching can explain why Christians, especially Catholics, regard Brian Holdsworth as some kind of rigorous intellectual, please leave me a comment. I'm genuinely curious. Now, if you got something out of this breakdown, or if you've ever been handed a video like this with the claim that it proves God, drop a comment. Let me know how you would have responded, or better yet, send me one that you'd like to see me respond to. I love pulling these things apart. If you're into logic, science, and calling out rhetorical sleight of hand dressed up as divine truth, consider subscribing, giving the video a like, and hitting the notification icon. Or drop by my Ko-fi account and leave a tip. I'm also starting a newsletter. Check the link in the description and the pinned comment. Whether it's chandelier chains or cosmic claims, I don't stop at because it just makes sense. Until next time, keep your feet on the ground, your head in the stars, and your BS detector dialed up to 11.